and they loved their family, and they made sure that we had as much time with their family and our cousins as possible, which was hard in those days.
We had reunions together. We were very family-centered, not just our family, but extended family, cousins. And although maybe it was not so often, several times a year sometimes, maybe once or twice a year for the more distant ones, it was like we were as close as if we'd seen each other often. He was always watching out for family, and so was Mother, making sure that they had everything they needed that we could provide or give.
Every year we'd have family vacations. Many times we went to the canyons, particularly Grand Canyon and Zions and Bryce, because we would go down to southern Utah to visit relatives.
We would go camping at Zion and Bryce and Grand every summer. Mother and Dad didn't have much money, and so we would go on vacations to the parks, and then we could also see their relatives in St. George and our grandparents. And we had this old Chevrolet, and I mean old. It was a 1940s vintage, and this was now the mid to late 50s. And it was two-door, not four-door. And Mother, bless her heart, would put all the bedding. So the sheets, the blankets, the pillows all went in, along with all of our food for a week, and everything, and the 7 of us, and the tent. I do not know how they did it. And I remember once when we were at Aunt Wanda's, Carl, who was in college and made a smart remark about, well, you can see the people who never travel, and I remember back at it, oh, Carl, if you only knew these folks that didn't have anything but were trying to give their children experiences. One time I remember we were at Bryce and we got in late and it was raining. It poured the whole night and all 7 of us slept sitting up. Do you remember that?
And I was small enough that I slept across all of your laps.
Oh, did you?
So I was the only one who slept.
Oh, the advantages of being the baby.
And we didn't even have enough sleeping bags to go around, so we'd sleep on quilts on the hard rocky ground, and take our food for a week. One week when we went, including going to Grand Canyon, we bought a head of lettuce and a quart of milk, and other than that we had food for the 7 of us for the week in the car. And I got the chance to help plan the meals and cook them, so that was a good experience.
And so I remember Mother cooking over the campfire. She cooked the entire dinner. There was no Coleman stove. There was none of that stuff, was there? And we ate like, kings and queens. And Dad would put up the tent, and all 7 of us would sleep in this one tent.
Now, once a year we would go to St. George and visit our grandparents on Dad's side, and we would stay there. They had a wonderful old house that was cool and had high ceilings. And we would sleep upstairs where he used to sleep in the attic, or on a little day bed that was in the side of the kitchen. And Aunt May had a wonderful garden full of flowers. She was a florist and grew most of her own, and they were exquisite. And so that was always fun to see what she was doing, making a new bouquet or picking them. And so that was, they had a swimming pool about a block away. We always went swimming. It was fun to go on there.
I remember that Aunt May was a florist on the side for St. George, and she kept flowers in the refrigerator. That was the first time I'd seen flowers in the refrigerator. And apparently there was a neat attic. It was hot, but it was large enough that we could go up the stairs and get into the attic and play around as kids.
I think when I was a very, very small child, we went to southern Utah often because my grandparents lived there. My grandfather died when I was 5, if I remember right. And then about a year later, they sold the house, and Aunt May, who was his second wife, who was really the only grandmother that I knew on that side of the family. So I loved her. She was fabulous. But when my grandfather died, they sold the house, and she ended up remarrying a professor at Utah State and moved to Logan. So we didn't go to St. George after that. To visit them, we didn't go. But when I was a very small child, they went every summer to St. George.
And when my grandfather Martin died, The only thing that Dad said he really wanted in the house was that clock and the benches. And I'm sure it was difficult to move, but Uncle John came back and he was an attorney and he had disposed of everything and taken care of selling the house, which we really appreciated because Dad, couldn't get away. And he said, gosh, I'm sorry, but I just had to sell the clock with the house. The people wanted it and so I sold it. But here's a whole bunch of boxes and things I found in the attic, and you can go through those. Well, it turns out that that was the most important thing that we could have ever been given because they were all the pictures, all the letters, all the things that we've been scanning that were absolutely priceless, and we have them thanks to that.
It was fun to go, and then we went to the parks. Since we were there, we always visited the Utah parks. That was our yearly vacation.
Because we had to travel a long ways, and because, being in a car and being with kids and keeping them occupied, and I look back now and think that was exhausting, but they never said that.
Summer, we would drive to Grand Canyon to drop my oldest sister off, and then my second to the oldest sister, Marcelly and Marianne, because they worked for the summer in Grand Canyon. And so we would take them down there to start their work for the summer, and then we got to see the canyon, and we would stop and see Bryce Canyon and Zion's Canyon, and stop in St. George and see my mother's brother who lived in St. George, and see the house that my dad grew up in St. George. It was kind of like a yearly thing for 3 or 4 years that we went to southern Utah. We would drive to Provo. I remember driving to Salt Lake to see Aunt Lila. Do you remember going to see Aunt Lila?
We should go see Aunt Liberta. I remember going to see
Aunt Liberta and Aunt Wanda. Yeah. And grandmother, my mother's mother, lived with Aunt Wanda in Provo, and I remember going to see her a lot. We would go on holidays and like grandmother's birthday. We would always go for grandmother's birthday. And Mom would always bake a cake and decorate it was always very special decorations for grandmother's birthday.
We lived far away because we were in Ogden, right? And to go from Ogden to Provo was a long ways because, you would go 50 miles an hour and you would not go on the freeway because there was no freeway. You'd go on Highway 89 and we'd go to Aunt Wanda's where Graham lived, and our cousins were there. Aunt Liberta and her kids had come over, and we saw cousins there. Or we'd go to Payson to Aunt Liberta's, which was way fun because, there were horses and there was the old outhouse that we'd sit in and several times a day.
No running water.
No running water. And I remember our cousins Elliot and Shan would trap little animals like skunks and squirrels, and their pelts were on the living room wall, and Aunt Liberta would cook over a wood stove.
They had a
and
pump. Water
a pump, yeah. And Timberline was their beautiful Palomino horse. And we've got a picture of Marianne and I on one of the horses, but not Timberline. And Uncle Ben was one of the all-time last cowboys. In fact, he named Shanley, who was his second son. There was Elliot and Shan. And he named Shanley after Bill Shanley, who was a baby in the Robbers Roost gang. And Mother always was just said, we were just so scandalized that he would. But actually, Shanley's a great name, and Shan's a great name.
I remember Aunt Mary coming once or twice in Idaho. She loved her English teapot, and she'd bring her little English teapot, and she always brought a nice gift for us. I remember her giving me Lassie Come Home, which I've always cherished. And I think I remember maybe once in 27th Street, and that's all. They see each other as we have reunions, but in those days people didn't use the phone. It was expensive, and you wrote occasionally, but I don't remember her writing necessarily. But their hearts were entwined. Probably more like once or twice a year when they were all the cousins, because they were in St. George and California and all over. Aunt Wanda's children lived in Provo mostly, so we knew them the best, and the cousins treated us royally. Most of them were, she had one daughter, Alma, all the rest were men, and they were really sweet to us, and they were about 10 to 12 years, 15 years older than us. So we were we were treated well.
Grandmother was kind of lavender. I don't know how else to explain that. She wore lavender. She had a lavender shawl, and she often wore lavender dresses. She
had an apron that had lavender flowers
She
on it,
did.
purple flowers.
She almost smelled like lavender. Grandmother was lavender. Yeah.
One thing I remember about grandmother's house that might be different for other people is that because water is so scarce in Utah, they have to save every bit of it, and so they have gutters at the edge of the road. At each in front of your house, there'd be these gutters. When they would open the irrigating, one person would open them, or after it rained, then they'd be full of water, and we loved to slosh around in these because you could get water up to about here, and we'd go up and down.
Go play in
Do
the
you
gutter.
remember that? Or
I
sitting on
do.
the edge of the gutter and playing in the
Yeah.
water, or making little boats out of whatever you had, and they'd sail down, and under the driveway, it would actually go into a tunnel and out the other side, which was exciting for kids. Then you'd run down there to see it coming out.
Make a
I remember as a child playing in that backyard, and there was a brick or a stone stove outside to cook outside.
See, I was 10 years younger, so I don't remember that.
But then I remember going back, like when I was in college, and the yard seemed so small, just from the different perspective of a child that we would play.
And she would lay us out on the floor at night on her quilts, all the cousins, and we would, after the tables had been moved away from dinner, and she would tell us stories or talk to us until we settled down. And it was wonderfully fun to be able to do that. And in the corner was a pump organ that was, I don't know who originated that. It was Aunt Gertrude's when we were there. Whether it started with her or came from grandmother, I'm not sure. But that was fun to play. And then we would stay overnight. And so there were beds for the adults, and the children were all on the floors. And we thought it was wonderful. And there were lots of us in the 20s, 30s.
I remember pumping that organ and you'd get the organ going, and you hardly had energy to play the keyboard.
However, we did take some other vacations. We went to Yellowstone, and the year I was 19, we went to Canada and went to Lake Louise and Banff, and that was a wonderful time. We stayed for the first time for a week in a motel in Cardston. It was a great price, and Mother and Dad went to the temple, and we thought it was wonderful to be in a motel because most of the time we camped.
One summer we decided we would take a trip to Canada, which turned out to be wonderful, and we went into Calgary and then Banff and Lake Louise, which is kind of interesting to think. I forget how old I was. I may have been 12, but it's interesting to think how old Janice would have been and where she was living in Calgary at the time, and obviously I was completely oblivious to the fact that I would ever marry a Canadian. But we loved the trip.
We went to Canada, and my parents had always wanted to drive to Canada. They wanted to go see Banff, and beautiful, fabulous scenery. Really pretty scenery. I just remember it being gorgeous scenery. But I remember driving to Canada, and I remember going over the border and thinking it was kind of exotic that we were leaving the United States. And and I remember my brother having his picture taken with one of the mounted police. That was kind of fun. But I remember that trip being one of the last ones that all of us were together, because Marsley went off to college, and then we didn't have the whole, it was kind of planned so that we could have a vacation with the entire family together. About a year later was when my dad was called to be bishop, and he never got away to go on vacation. My parents were always great at planning trips and then not taking them. Or planning them for 4 or 5 years and then finally taking them. I think once we all left home, they did a little more traveling, but you know, taking 5 kids is a little overwhelming. I was the only child left at home, and everybody else had graduated and gone off to college, and for the summer, I was the only child left at home. And my mom and dad had the opportunity to go with my dad's brother to South Dakota. It's where the Mount Rushmore is. My parents had always wanted to drive to Mount Rushmore with my father's brother in his RV, and they had talked for years about someday we're gonna drive to the Black Hills of North Dakota. It was to hear them talk about it. It was really romantic. When we did it, I thought this is kind of no man's land, but it was kind of my dad loved to be outdoors, and his brother did too, and it was kind of the thing that the two of them were always going to do, and so they were going to go as the two couples. But the problem was me. I was too old to have a babysitter, but too young to leave alone. Well, they never discussed it in my presence, so I never felt like I was the problem. And I remember my mom saying to me, "Would you like to come with us?" And I said, "Just me?" And she said, "Yeah, we've decided we'd like to take you with us." "You would?" I just thought that was great. I was thrilled. I thought it was so much fun. What a great adventure. And I just thought this would be really fun. And it never dawned on me, the whole entire trip, it never dawned on me that I was an extra piece that they really didn't need to take. They could have figured out some way to leave me with somebody and not take me. But they took me. And I had a fabulous trip. And happy, happy memories of that trip. And I'm so glad that they never made me feel bad that I tagged along. They all four of them made me feel happy that I was along.
In 1970, Helen Marr and I were working in New York and living with Marianne and John. And Mother and Dad came through and spent some time in New York. They went to see some friends in Long Island because Dad had been the Scoutmaster and had also worked with these boys down on the Lower East Side.
When I was a junior in high school, I went for the summer and lived with my sister Marianne in New York. She lived in Hartsdale, New York. And I worked for the summer in Manhattan. And at the end of the summer, my parents drove to New York, and we flew out of New York and flew to Brazil and picked up Doug and brought him home from his mission. But before we went to Brazil, we went to Argentina. We spent a couple of days in Argentina. And then we picked Doug up, and then we spent 2 or 3 days in Brazil. We went to Peru and toured. Fabulous memory of traveling with my parents. We went to Machu Picchu, and we went to Buenos Aires, and we went to Rio, and wonderful memories of that trip, that I was able to go with them and spend the time with them. We ended up having me start school about 3 weeks late. And Mom went to the principal and talked to him and said, can we do this? Is there a way that we can make up the work? And he said, "Oh, this is much more educational than actually going to school." So they let me go. The school had no problem with me going, but I had to keep notes of everything I did. And I made a careful journal of everywhere we went and everything we did, and the things I learned, which, I had a little travelogue of the city of Buenos Aires. Everything we wrote down that we did there, and Machu Picchu, and we went to, I'm trying to think of the name of the place in northern Brazil where we saw this fabulous dancing, and my mom was so excited to be learning about all these places along with me. So I came home having had a course in South American culture